Hi guys, Pete here, N6QW, and you're staring right down the throat of a sideband engineer's Model 34, SBE-34. This is a rig from the late 1960s, along about 1966-67, and followed the first hybrid rig, as such as we know it from the US, the model SBE-33. The SBE-34 had quite a few refinements over its younger brother, the SBE-33, in that it had a self-contained power supply back here, which was both AC and DC operated. To put this on DC, you simply plugged in a different power cord, and the power supply acted as an inverter and a high voltage supply for the three tubes. Primarily had solid state devices in it and a Collins filter, but the three tubes were an equivalent of a 12BY7 driving a pair of 6 GB5s, which were sweep tubes. The original SBE-33 had 27 GB5 tubes in it, because they did like the All-American 5, they seriesed them, so you had 54 on the filament, 54 volts on the filaments, 12 volts on the driver. Got you to 66, and they used some dropping resistors in there because the SBE-33 was operated directly off of the 110 volt power source, and they used a voltage quadrupler off the mains to essentially develop 450 volts. It was kind of a widowmaker. You had a polarized cord, and the polarized cord was such that had a neon tube in the back, a neon NE2, and if it glowed, you had to plug in the wrong way. The SBE-34 was a refinement to that. Although I liked the 33 because the band spread was a little bit different and had a little broader coverage. Essentially, it used what's called a Geneva mechanism, where you had a band switch that when you moved it through the arc, it actually switched the circuitry to the appropriate band. And then you had a small range here you can see with the fat lines that you could then tune up the circuits. The VFO, even though it was it's an analog VFO, but it wasn't just a VFO stage. It's a 3-gang capacitor, so as you tune the VFO, it tuned some other stages, kind of like the Collins, so that you were always tuning the other stages as you needed. It suffered from a lot of problems. AGC was terrible. This particular unit added a thing called a pitch tuning, which was like a RIT and a dial correct. I got to tell you, lots of times these ended up being transmitting and receiving on different frequencies. Not real good. Had a lot of popularity. Guys bought these and put them in boats and that sort of thing, but for its time, it was quite advanced, but as the technology moved along, it got outpaced by the stuff that was coming out of the Far East. As a matter of fact, about the same time that the SBE-34 came out, the FTDX 100 from Yaesu was their first entry, and it was a far superior rig. As a matter of fact, if you look on my website, the other one I have, JES Systems, you'll see what I did with an FTDX 100. I acquired this over a year ago, and essentially paid about 20 bucks for it, but the shipping was like $60 or $70 to get it here, so it was like $90, and I got it, and I had some problems. I mainly bought it with the idea of the crystal filter, but when I got it, I found out that it was just actually the problems I could fix, and I just got around to fixing them. Essentially, I replaced all the electrolytic capacitors because it just squealed and howled on receive and transmit, and I knew it was a capacitor problem, and just finished doing that yesterday. Right now, that's on 20 meters, and it does okay on 20 and 40 and 80. I can get about 60 watts out on 40 and 80. I haven't seen that on 20, but that problem is I think something in the alignment. So the basic transceiver works okay. because I've loaded it up on 40 and 80, and you'll get 60 watts out easy. At 20, I'm only seeing about 30, and I haven't tried on 15. But it used germanium PNP transistors in here, which are really hard to find. I do have a stock. They're the 2N2672s, and they're a matte, M-A-D-T, and boy, they're really hard to find. So you don't ever want to blow a transistor in here because you'll never find one. But there is a NTE 170 that'll work in there, but not real well. So anyway, Drifty VFO, it was heterodyne. There are 4 crystals in there to put it on the right bands, but the VFO operates on 1 frequency, so it's 20 meters right now.
It's not as accurate. It's a good way to learn the program.
That's 20 meters.
And then when you get proficient with it, you can pay up.
Here's the delta tune. Kind of hear that drifting by there. Not real good.
Now things down to a very accurate modeling. And
that was the intention was where you had a round table and you had people on different frequencies. Back in the 60s, it was not common that you were within 10 hertz. I mean, on 40 meters now with the SDR police running their Flex 6700s, they'll tell you you're 10 hertz off. Back then it was like kilohertz, and that's why this function was put in there.
From the top, it would look like a small sticker.
Upper and lower sideband.
The ends come down about the same.
This one happens to have a, we're lucky it has to happen to have the crystal calibrator in it. Let me see if we can pick up the signal. That was on 14250. There you go. It's way off. It's off on the band, so the crystals must be aging. So that's the crystal calibrator. Anyway, pretty noisy. But hey, it had a Collins filter in it. Oh, that's lower sideband. You can tell the gradations of tick marks are 5 kilohertz. That would never work with the SDR police. But for 1960s, small compact package, this actually weighs quite a bit because it used an all-steel chassis. And you have to be kind of careful because there's a lot of high voltage running around here. So when you get the case off, but I fixed it so that it receives okay and transmits okay, but not anything like I can build today. It was kind of fun to be able to go back in there, and it was a real challenge to get the electrolytics out. It was the same problem I saw with the FTDX100 from Yaesu. It was built in the factory, it worked fine. You had to maintain it, forget it, and this is the same problem here. There were variants of this. Originally, Sideband Engineers was in Rancho Bernardo down near San Diego, and it was started by Faust Gonset, who, those of you may be familiar with the Gonset radios. This was his first offering. This was later then sold to Linear Systems, and then I think Raytheon bought the operation. Initially, the SBE-34 and the early 34s had plug-in transistors, and that was kind of nice because if you'd had to do any servicing, then later they found it was probably not a good idea, and so they soldered them into the circuit board. So you had to do any transistor replacement, kind of tough, really hard. But you can see some of the Collins-like a Raytheon type wiring, and like what Gonset did. You could tell if any wiring is original because every soldered connection, after it was soldered from the factory, they put a red dot on it, just like they do in the military side of things. So this way you can you know where that the wiring has been done and hasn't been touched. If you see don't see the red dot on there, you know that someone has messed with it. So This was not. No one did any kind of butcher job or hack job on this. All I did was replace filter capacitors. Not all of them, but all the ones in the receive and transmit in the low level stages. I don't think we'll hear anything on. This is 20 meters. I do have a 2-element beam on the front end of this thing. So AGC doesn't work real good. Pretty typical.
70s today. It may break up to about 82. And so I need to remember to go out and
15 meters gave only about 50 watts out. Aligning these things was always a bear. I never was really
Situation's over with.
successful in getting them aligned on all 4 bands.
Tell me he's got the washing machine running. So I come down here and hear it running, so then when it stops, I gotta throw his stuff.
Well, we're going to put the antenna on 40 meters. And we'll see what we're hearing on 40.
That was the first time since Saturday night. The other station is almost the game. I call you
again. And Joe, would you, or David, would you bring in Alpha Alpha India, please? Over to you.
Quite a few nets on this morning in 40 meters.
That thing went, Greg, you're just a tickle now. Have Frank, I'm going to have to roll
Yeah,
it
it's definitely more sensitive on the lower bands.
Anyway,
But for 1960s technology, foreign broadcast. You got to let this warm up for about half an hour before you try to operate it, much like these solid-state VFO, early VFOs. Looks like about the right size you could put a color TFT in there, but I'm not going to cover this up.
Sacramento, which is due east of San Francisco, which is, I think, due east of
40
Tokyo.
meters.
Anyway, good morning to all. I have no real news to report, and I'll turn it back to net control. I'm off my 2 Australian shepherds at 8 o'clock. You all have a good day. We'll catch you tomorrow. Kilo Mike 6, Alpha Alpha India, Al in Fair Oaks. Back to net.
When I hear a KM6 call, I think of my KM6 call, which was on Midway, but they're now in California, not Midway. So anyway, this is a trip with the SBE-34. Had some nice features and functionality for its time. But we sure have moved on technologically. Had a built-in speaker, built-in power supply, 60 watts. They sold a linear, the SBL2. They actually had an SBL1, SBL2. We're good for 500-600 watts, and this will drive the SB200. Had solid-state switching on the relays. As a matter of fact, this whole rig is solid-state switching. When you hit the push to talk, it actually changes some bias, so there aren't relays in here as we normally think of the relays. So that's kind of interesting. It's got a fuse built into the wiring. One time I blew a fuse. I've had several of these. And man, I just chased my tail trying to find a fuse, and then I found out it's actually soldered into the circuit. So anyway, a little trip down memory lane. The meter reads the plate current on the tubes or RF output, and I never found it to be really good. As a matter of fact, one of the mods was to actually use this as an S meter, involved some pretty exotic wiring to do it. I did that, and I was never really satisfied with it, but somebody came up with a hack. You know, like the Bitx hacks. This had a hack to convert this cheapo meter to a S meter.
Looking for Europe on the long path inlet.
This is a DX group, a low end of 40 meters every morning.
It's at the bottom of a pole that slides into the mount, so it doesn't stick out.
Got a nice Collins filter in it. As I said, I bought this mainly for the Collins filter, but when I saw what good shape it was in, I decided to try to fix it, and finally got around to replacing all the capacitors. So this is Pete, N6QW. Thank you for riding along. A little trip of nostalgia here on the SBE-34. Front panel's in immaculate shape, and so is the case. So I could not see, you know, cobbling with this other than fixing it. And I may try to get a little more power out in 20 meters and try operating there. I didn't try 15. So anyway, thank you for riding along. This is N6QW, and this is the SBE-34, 2018, January. So this rig is probably easily in the 50-year-old range. So hard to believe what the technology was then. Analog VFO, just think what adding a solid-state final to this and a digital VFO could really bring a lot of life to this, but you'd have to do a lot of extensive rework and rewiring, which I'm not prepared to do. Anyway, thank you for riding along and enjoying the SBE-34 N6QW here.